എന്താ കേൾക്കാൻ പറ്റാത്തതുണ്ട്. വെബിനാർ ഞാൻ ഒഴിച്ചോളാം.
Good morning, dear participants. Thank you for joining the online workshop conducted by Christ Nagar College, Marunallur, Thiruvananthapuram. Christ Nagar College, Marunallur, Thiruvananthapuram is an arts and science college affiliated to the University of Kerala. It is run by CMI fathers, the pioneers in the field of education and social reforms. I wholeheartedly welcome all the participants and a resource person, Dr. Babita Marina Justin, to this creative writing workshop titled Techniques in Poetry Writing. Though Dr. Babita Marina Justin needs no introduction, let me introduce her in a few words. She is the Associate Professor of IIST Thiruvananthapuram, a noted poet, artist, and academic. She has many published works and prestigious awards to her credit. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Krishna Priya. First of all, I'd like to thank the college for inviting me and all the participants who are here. Respected Principal Jolly Jacob, Rani ma'am, and Krishna Priya, who helped me with all these Zoom meetings and all. I'm indebted to you. Thank you so much for inviting me here. And thank you also for all the participants to come here for such a meeting. Meeting of poetry. Let's not make it very formal. If you have any questions, you can keep on asking. Towards the end, I can answer your questions and queries. Now, this poetry workshop, I would call it that, or seminar, webinar, it's like divided into 3 parts. The first part, I'd like to talk about the techniques of poetry. Most of you are already familiar with the techniques. Now, I'd like you to brush it up. So, I'll be introducing a few techniques. Second, we look at a couple of poems. If we look at 2 poems, and we look at how we are going to analyze. We've been doing it all our lives, but let's again, brush up poetry analysis as such. And in the third part, I would like I'll give you some themes, I'll give you some kind of some kind of the feedback, and I want you to try writing a poem and send it to me so that I can choose one and I can give it to the college authorities so they can put it up somewhere on their Facebook page or somewhere like that. So these are the 3 parts. Now, one second. Somebody wants to come in and she wants a link. So let me just send the link for a minute. Uh, Sorry for the inconvenience. So these are the three parts that we are going to, uh, in fact, take a look at. So in the beginning, what we'll do is we'll look at the various devices for writing poetry. Poetry is a kind of something, they say that on the end of all drama, at the end of all life, you have poetry. Poetry is something that actually flows out from your soul, or spontaneous feelings which are already collected in tranquility. Let me tell you that's not exactly true. Poetry, of course, it comes from the depth of your honesty, no doubt about it. At the same time, there's also plenty of hard work which goes into poetry. It's not like you sit with pen and paper, uh, you know, near a stream or something, and just in an instant, poetry comes to you and then it overflows. Nothing like that. I'm not talking from my point of view. I've talked to a lot of poets all over the world, and what I have heard from most of the poets is that it's a lot of sweat and toil over a piece of paper. And that's why, poetry becomes slightly difficult. So there's a saying in Malayalam that, at 17, everybody writes poetry. Even a donkey writes poetry. Kavithayum Kavithayam, that's what they say. So all of us must have written poetry at 17, because 17 is the crucial age, when you fall in love, when you're full of youthful ideals and stuff like that. So all of you must have, in fact, written poetry at some point or the other. So my purpose here is to, help you read poetry in a different way, or just polish your reading skills, and then perhaps, just let you write into it with a kind of smoothness that you would be aspiring for. Now, so everybody must have tried your hand at writing poetry at one point or the other. I'm sure about that. If there's, uh, if there's anybody who hasn't actually uh, written poems, you can tell me towards the end, because I can always note it down in the next poetry class. I can quote you. Now, I would like to share certain things. I would like to share the screen. So, can you help me screen sharing?
Oh, sure, ma'am. Yes, ma'am, in a minute. In a minute. I'll make you the
Yeah.
host. In a minute.
Yes. So, the first part is about the kind of techniques in writing poetry. As I have already told you, poetry writing is different from that of prose. Again, we know it right from school. The first things, we learn at school are rhymes, nursery rhymes. So we know that it's entirely different from writing prose. And the techniques of poetry writing are also entirely different from prosaic kind of techniques. Now, these techniques have a lot of literary devices in that. What you call literary devices. Let me first share the screen. One second.
Babita ma'am, now you are the host. Now you can share the screen.
Fine, fine, fine. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am.
So, what I was saying was that the entire language of poetry is different from that of prose. So, language of poetry have a lot of literary devices in them, and these literary devices are something that we use. At times we use it on a daily basis. See, the initial hiccups are there, so I beg your pardon. Krishna Priya, what should I do? There, there are these people waiting and all. Would you be admitting them, or should I be doing that?
Ma'am, can you make me the host? Ma'am, can you make me the host for a minute?
All right,
Okay, ma'am.
all right. Um, Now, how do I make you the host? Because lots of people are there in the waiting room, and
Ma'am, can you see National Webinar, the chat, my chat?
how do I make you the host?
Yeah. Mm,
Hello, ma'am. Please stop your screen sharing.
Okay. And
Okay.
then,
Then the host will do
ma'am, now
rest.
you
all right.
can, ma'am, now you
Ah,
can share the screen.
oh, fine. So two people cannot be host at the same time. Okay, is that the one?
Now, ma'am, if you want to make other people enter,
Hmm.
the primary one can only what do you say, give them permission.
All right, all right. So would you take over that, Krishna Priya?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, you can continue. No problem.
Oh, fine, fine,
Okay, ma'am.
fine, fine. Thank you. Okay. So what I was saying was the language of poetry is entirely different from the language of prose. We use a series of figurative language. You have both literal meanings and figurative meanings. So you use a series of figurative language to, in fact, talk in poetry. For example, you have metaphors. Metaphors, as most of you know, are something in which something which compares two things. All right, and this kind of compare, I'll write it down here. Can I do it? So the initial hiccups will be there. I would like you to please adjust with that for a while. Okay. When you're talking about metaphor, it's a kind of a direct comparison of two things. It's like it implies that one object is the other object. For example, life is a box of chocolates, Claire is a flighty sparrow. So this is what metaphor is all about. You compare. You when you compare, you become that thing. For example, there is this famous song which says, I am a rock, I am an island. All right. So there is this kind of a direct comparison which happens, and there is a metaphor for you. Now, after metaphor, there's something like simile, which you all of you know, right? So anyway, when you talk about metaphorical language, you in fact compare something as something. Compare something as the thing alone. But then in simile, what happens is that you seek to compare two things which are in fact not alike at all. In fact, you use like and as to compare stuff. Okay. For example, if I say my love is like a red, red rose, there is a simile. When I say my love is a red, red rose, that is a metaphor. So you use as and like to compare in simile. And metaphor, the object becomes the subject. All right. So this is primary stuff about similes. And when I say you're the apple of the eye, that is obviously a metaphor. When I say you're like the apple of my eye, that is, or this was as clear as mud. Mud is not clear. All right. So that becomes a simile as such. Now, this kind of language, which we use in poetry, does not actually end there. There's like innumerable kind of figurative language when it comes to poetry, because poetry is a place where you unleash your imagination, to the horizons. Say it's like an arch where through gleams that kind of experience of life, and from there, you can actually even let your imagination be free. But then there were people, in fact, who let their imaginations free. But imaginations also have some kind of bearing. They should have some kind of bearing with each other. Should be some kind of connections between each other. Uh, the next kind of language uh, is the personification. So personification is the type of language where non-human things are in fact uh, assigned to human, or human emotions are is kind of assigned to non-human emotions. For example, the wind whispered to me, and I say the wind whispered to me, or the bird told me a secret. Uh, we are, of course, bird is not human. Bird is alive, but still, you are in fact giving a lot of human attributes to non-human stuff, and that's personification. So there are so many famous kind of personification devices in, in poetry, and especially Pablo Neruda was a poet who, in fact, used to use a lot of personification, kind of personification. And he, in fact, gave life to stones. And even Srimas Heni, one of those poets whom we'll be taking up later on for analysis. So Srimas Heni has also used a lot of metaphor personified the message. Even a kind of bell, it rings with life. It rings with philosophy. Then definitely you have kind of musical devices in poetry. Musical devices, uh, we know about rhyme and meter. There are different kinds of rhymes and meters. Meter is metrical compositions, are kind of meters in English poetry. And in fact, metrical compositions are not something that we use right now. We use free verse. Free verse is that we do not adhere to. We means poets who are writing right now, contemporary poets. So what I've seen in new poets all over is the fact that, a lot of them are enamored by romantic poets. We are fond of our Sheets and Shelley. We are fond of Wordsworth. We are fond of Coleridge. Keats. Keats is somebody who ignore it all. So, and because of that kind of an influence, that we read a lot of romantic poems and poets as such, we also tend to, in fact, um, we tend to imitate them. We tend to imitate their rhyme schemes and metrical schemes, etc. But in contemporary verse, maybe I would say around 80 years or something, we have actually given up kind of metricalities or metrical traditions as such. But there's something, we are the musicality, the internal rhyme and the meter is always something that is sustained by poets. That comes with a little bit of habit. When you keep writing, when you keep listening, when you keep saying those things aloud, what happens is that you get used to that kind of music in poetry. So even without rhyme or metrical stanzas, you can in fact listen to the internal rhyme of poetry as such. So that is what this musicality of poetry is all about. And this musicality of poetry can be enhanced with devices like alliteration. So I will give you a small example of what exactly alliteration is. So alliteration is a repetition of initial consonant sound. For example, Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers. Per, 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 per. That is the consonant sound, especially the initial consonant sound, is like repeated, and that's alliteration. So that actually enhances the musicality of poetry. Then after alliteration, you have something called the assonance. One second. So assonance is a repetition of the vowel sound, and I'll be showing you plenty of examples of assonance later on. One second. Here's like assonance. It's a repetition of vowel sound. For example, on a proud. One second. On a proud round cloud in a white high night. Ow, 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 I night. And so all night tide, night and tide. Okay, so the vowel sound inside every word is right rhyming, and that's called the assonance. And I lie down by the side of my darling, my life and my bride. This is a poem by Edgar Allan Poe called Annabel Lee. And then you also have consonants as a repetition of consonant sounds. If you ask me if the poets now use all these things, they definitely do. One second. So consonance is a repetition of consonant sounds, especially at the end of every word. The clocks on fox tick, clocks on knocks talk, 6 6 bricks stick, 6 6 chicks talk. The skers and cur and x, these are all rhyming towards the end. The repetition of consonant sounds towards the end is a consonants. So you have you have alliteration, you have assonance and consonants, and there's something what you call some kind of word that imitates the sound is there. That's uh, that's called the onomatopoeia. Word which sounds like uh, what you're talking about. So once again, a word that imitates a sound, it represents buzz and sizzle and hiss and splash. So poets basically, and if you're a poet, they're very fond of such words. Words really matter. In fact, what happens is that I have seen a lot of poets uh, take theme as the matter. See, there are two things. You have content and form. Content is very important, and especially in performance poetry and even in activist poetry, content really matters because you're actually speaking about some kind of a social event that is happening right now. Some kind of a social problem is highlighted in such poems. But poets also take a good look at the form they're writing. They're extremely self-conscious of the language they're using, because poetry is all about musicality. Musicality doesn't mean that it has to rhyme all the time or it has to be metrical and stuff like that. But these, figurative musical usages of consonants and alliterations and onomatopoeia and hyperbole and stuff like that, they really help in enhancing the form of the poem. Okay, uh, it doesn't actually mean that we have to overdo it. Also, we have to be careful while using it. Then comes to the hyperbole. Um, that is when you exaggerate things, like 10,000 saw at a glance. That's what Wordsworth says, right? When he sees the daffodils, he says 10,000 saw at a glance. And you know that it's exaggeration. So, kind of a deliberate exaggeration or overstatement. This poetry project is killing me if I say that. This class lasts forever. If you think like that, that is hyperbole. That is the exaggeration within you. That's like telling you. Then repetition. You have a lot of repetition. You have, uh, kind of repeating stuff like the use of any element of language or sound or word or phrase, a sentence. More than once is like repetition. And in poetry, as in music, you definitely use repetition quite a lot. Imagery is the descriptive or figurative language that we use, like metaphors and similes and personification and etc. Then you have symbols that uh, represent something. For example, symbols is an object that represents something. Black stands for death or sadness. One second, I'll just an object that represents something else. Black for death, red for love. So these are cliched kind of symbols, um, or sadness and depression. All these kind of symbols that you use. Definitely cliche. You can think of new things. Poets, and especially poets abroad. there are these poetry courses, diploma in poetry writing, and MFA, Master in Fiction Studies, etc., where you have poetry comprehension, poetry writing. It's a big deal in the West. We have master's programs on that, and there, it's a kind of there's a kind of literary rat race which happens where you have people looking for symbols. They're always in search of symbols. They're looking for metaphors. So the cliches, the things that you hear every day, like black for death, for sadness, etc., you can think differently. And this is where you have to actually come at your own idiom. If you're serious at writing poetry, then definitely when another person reads your poem without reading your name, that person should know, okay, this is definitely this person's poems. And there is where you, in fact, develop your own idiomatic language, your own poetic idioms. Then the next kind of figurative usage is called allusion. Allusion is like a reference to a well-known person, place, literary work of art, etc. So when we go into Shima's Heni today, I'll show you the allusions, and of course, any literary student, it's like the entire literary world is full of allusions. Greek allusions and early Greek classical allusions, have Roman allusions. You have allusions from the Mahabharata and the Ramayana and the Bible. So we are just overridden by stories and people and so many instances. And these instances for a poet, uh, he or she, I would say she because would definitely be alluding to certain even the political happenings which is occurring right now. So these kind of allusions keep on occurring. And the next musical quality that in fact I'd like to go into is the rhyme. Rhyme is a repetition of similar sounds, as you know, right? So, repetition of similar sounds at the end of words is a rhyme. Example, two words diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both, and be one traveller long I stood, and I looked down as far as I could. So, rhyme is something which, in fact, towards the end of the words, you have the repetition of similar sounding words. So by now you should be knowing that it's just not content, but the form in poetry is also very, very important. I would not go into meter because meter is a rhythmical pattern of a poem, and it's actually determined by the number of stresses and beats. You have an unstressed syllable and an stressed syllable, and the beats in the poem are all very important. But then meter is something that I wouldn't go into because I am a propounder of free verse, and a lot of writers who write right now write with a free verse in mind. Usually, people consider metrical language in poetry, unless you're doing it very consciously, as something archaic. For example, even the usage of language. If you use romantic, the language of yesterday, like language of yore, what we'll say. Uh, if you use the language which was like fashionable 50 years back, for example, when you write die and your and thou and stuff like that, when you write that, it's called archaism, archaic language. So meter has also become kind of archaic, but there is a movement all across the US. I know some friends of mine who also, in fact, uh, are big uh, followers of that movement, who in fact say that meter in poetry is very, very important. Okay, so that is your choice. If you want to write, you can either use a metrical language or you cannot. But then you should be using it without sounding archaic, and that's very, very important. Now, the next the next point that I would like to, talk to you is about the author's purpose. As an author, as a poet, let me say, as a poet, you will have a particular purpose in your mind, right? Uh, the purpose of an author can always be to share feelings. You can share your joy, but I haven't seen many poets sharing joy. Okay, usually you can tell a story. You can talk about love. Love is something which is universal. All poets are actually written about love, and it's like it's all kind of universal kind of stuff. And you can talk about sadness, you can talk about anger, you can talk about fear, you can talk about loneliness, you can tell a story, narrate a story, you can talk about an epic, you can talk about history. So, what exactly is like the author's purpose? And what, in fact, what is the description of this dog is going to and fro. He knows that something is happening here, so he wants to be around. So the poet's intention or the purpose is definitely uh, there in the description of the poems. It's there in the story, in the feelings. All right. Um, and then there is also it's also there in the message, it's also there in the irony, it's also there in the humor that you in fact talk about in the poem. So now when I say my stomach was a stone sinking the way I felt and hollow and alone. So Dorothy Aldis, she talks about the poetic intention here. Let me just cut and paste here. My stomach was a stone, sinking the way I felt, and hollow and alone. What is the kind of purpose of the poet here? Poet, in fact, talks about her loneliness, saying that her stomach was a stone. It was sinking, and the way she felt was hollow. So it was she was actually talking about. She's actually talking about the void, the loneliness, the hollowness, and the aloneness that she feels. And through her stomach, she in fact uses the stomach, in fact, to indicate her loneliness. All of us know that we have a kind of a particular feeling in our stomach, when we are in love, or whenever we feel somebody who whom we love or whom we hate. So stomach is something that really, really reacts, and stomach also reacts to the kind of loneliness which is all around her. So she's lost and scared, and that's exactly the purpose of the poet here. So yeah, in the next, it's a very sweet poem that I'm going to share next here. This is a poem by one second. Okay, I hope everybody can see. Shel Silverstein, Jimmy Jet and his TV set. I'll tell you the story of Jimmy Jet, and you know what I tell you is true. He loved to watch his TV set almost as much as you. He watched all day, he watched all night, till he grew pale and lean. From the early show to the late show, all the shows in between, he watched till his eyes were frozen wide. And his bottom grew into his chair, and his chin turned into a tuning dial, and antennae grew out of his hair. So, in this particular poem, what you can see is that you can see a young person's addiction to TV. And Shel Silverstein, who is a very famous writer, for childhood, for children. He says that it's like his brain's turned into TV tubes and his face to a TV screen, and two knobs saying "Vert" and "Horizon" grew where his ears had been. So this boy, Jimmy Jet himself, in fact, started becoming a TV. He started becoming a kind of an instrument or a gadget to which he was addicted to. So there's a kind of warning here. The author's purpose, definitely, the poet's purpose has a kind of warning that's given to everybody. After Jimmy Jet, um, there's another poem that I'd like to share with you. One second. I'm not used to the whiteboard as such, so that's why. It's I cannot share it here, but I'll definitely read it out. Pages and pages, a seesaw of ideas. Share the adventure. Fiction, non-fiction, though to our past and future, swinging back and forth. Wham! The book slams shut, and we read it together with our minds open. So this particular story is sending a message and sharing the adventure. It is sending a serious message. The message of the theme is that reading is an adventure and that can be shared. It's by Frederick McKissack. Now, in a humorous poem, the poet's purpose out here it's called Insights. I'm very grateful to my skin for keeping all my insights in. I do so hate to think about what I'd like to look inside out. So here it's like a humorous poem for the purpose of skin. What is the purpose of skin? It's to keep me intact, keep everything without spilling. Everything has to be kept intact. So poetry as such, and the poet's purpose as such also has to be the content has to in fact be in tune with the kind of you're using. So in poetry, why poetry I would say is kind of difficult a process to evolve is that your content has to be in tune with the kind of form that you're using. So your content and tune has to go hand in hand. And that is precisely why that is the biggest challenge of people who write poetry. And see, my poet friends, we always used to say that there's also something called practice in poetry, which is very, very important. And every day, you need to practice, even if it's two lines. If you write 2 lines every day, that's fine too. But being in touch with poems, I've read about this woman writer. In fact, she's a domestic worker. She says that every day, every time she gets some kind of an idea, she writes it down. Perhaps it's on a piece of paper, a scrap, or some kind of torn newspaper. She keeps on writing, and this is very very important. Whatever snatches of ideas that you get wherever you are, trying to write them down and writing them down on a daily basis becomes very important in practicing or in your travel, in your becoming a poet. And now to become a poet, it's also very important, to understand poetry. Reading poems is very, very important in writing poems. It's like, and reading poems means, of course, we all read from Shakespeare's sonnets to Wordsworth to Keats. We keep reading poems, and which is very good. But reading contemporary poems is very, very important. As you know, all over the world, people practice poetry with so much of seriousness. Uh, there is a kind of a rat race happening, literary rat race, and you have people doing their masters in poetry writing, people getting published all over, people writing in journals, etc. And writing English poetry from India and getting them published elsewhere, it's a great achievement. You have to think about getting yourself published elsewhere, and writing your poems and floating them in Facebook, that's fine. You'll get a lot of likes. People will like them, and you will also feel happy. But then it's like a little bit of more approval when uh, when it gets published either on online magazines or journals or in print magazines, in print journals. And definitely, if you go for the kind of competition that there is, it's always wonderful if you go ahead and get your stuff, get your poetry published in place in the kind of places that you would aspire to. There are so many journals like the Rattle. You have very famous the New Yorker poetry, etc., where it's very difficult to get the poems published. But definitely, if you're a poet, you should have it in mind that these are the places you aspire, and one day you will definitely reach there. And for that, uh, the kind of spontaneity that you had been taught all along definitely is the kind of message that you have got. I would say it's a wrong message because spontaneity is just a spark. The rest is all like all the hard work you put into it. You are always searching for metaphors. All right. You're searching for metaphors, you're looking for symbols, you're looking for the right language, you're looking for the rhyme and reason within poetry, you're looking for the content within poetry. You're in fact looking for every kind of aspect which will enhance the form and content of poetry, so that what you get in 18 to 20 lines or 18 to 26 lines, or even 10 to 15 lines, is the well edited work, which in fact talks about a lot of things. Fine. So the purpose also definitely have to come out. The purpose has to come out pretty well, along with along with your, uh, in fact, the content, along with the form. And the mood of the poems, you see, mood is very, very important as such. For example, if I say in the mornings, very early, that's the time, when I wake up barefoot. Uh, One second, I'll just paste it out here. One second. Mm, One second. I stopped the share screen. Let me share this here. Can you see? Can you see now?
Yes, ma'am.
Barefoot days. So when I say in the morning, very early, that's the time I'd love to
No.
go. Can
Excuse
you
me,
hear
ma'am.
now? Yeah.
Excuse me, ma'am. I can't see your screen.
Okay, okay. One second. Sorry, these technical problems, it's like holding me back. Please excuse me for this. I'll try to paste. Okay.
Can see, ma'am.
Now can you see?
Yes, ma'am. Yes,
Can
ma'am.
you see the whiteboard?
Yes, ma'am.
Uh, mm-mm. There's something wrong. One second, one second, one second. Can you see now? Hello?
No, ma'am.
No, no.
No.
Okay, I think now I'll come to this thing. I'll go into poetry reading. One second, one second. Hello.
Hello.
I'm so sorry. There's something happening. I cannot. In fact, okay.
It's okay, ma'am.
Oh, okay, okay. Can you see now?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, yes. We can see the screen. You can start. Yes. No worries.
So sorry about this.
It's okay.
Okay. I'm going to cut and paste this poem, which is called The Personal Helicon by Seamus Heaney. In this session, we will see how exactly we are going to read a poem. So, all of us must have actually read this poem. A lot of you must have read this poem. But then, while you read this poem, we should look into the poetic techniques that we have already discussed out here. Okay, this particular poem is by Seamus Heaney. He's an Irish poet, as you know. He was an Irish poet, passed away, a Nobel laureate. And of course, his poem is written for Michael Longley. He says, as a child, they could not keep me from wells and old pumps with buckets and windlasses. I loved the dark drop that trapped sky, the smells of waterweed, fungus, and dank moss. One in the brickyard with a rotted broad top savored the rich crash when a bucket plummeted down at the end of a rope, so deep you saw no reflection of it. How do I scroll up? Yeah. A shallow one under a dry stone ditch, fructified like any aquarium. When you dragged out long roots from the soft mulch, a white face hovered over the bottom. Others had echoes, gave back your own call with a clean new music in it. And one was chasm, for there, out of ferns and tall folks' gloves, a rat slapped across. Oh, I can't scroll up. Okay. A rat slapped across my reflection. Oh, now to pry into roots, to fingers line, to stare big-eyed narcissus into some spring is beneath all adult dignity. I rhyme to see myself, to set darkness echoing. In this particular poem by Seamus Heaney, which is called The Personal Helicon, uh, Heaney uses almost all the poetic techniques that we in fact talked about. And he talks about one small metaphor, one very simple metaphor. And this metaphor is from the wells, is the wells. You he talks about the wells and how, as a child, he loved looking into the wells. As a child, they could not keep me from wells. All of us must also have experienced, with nostalgia, we must have experienced the experience of looking into the wells, uh, gazing into, right? And as children and as adults, we definitely do look into the wells. And he says that old pumps with buckets and wooden glasses. Uh, Again, these are again all the stuff that we have around the well, right? Pumps and buckets and windlasses, and the dark drop. It plummets into the dark drop. And inside the well, what you can see is a trapped sky, the smells of waterweed, fungus, and dank moss. So when when the bucket falls, there's a kind of dark drop. Into the darkness, the bucket drops. And there is a trapped sky, the smells of waterweed, and there's a smell of fungus and dank moss. So in this particular, the first line is a quatrain. You have 4 lines in it, and it's a quatrain. In the first stanza, what you can see is a child looking into the well. When the child looks into the well, he can also see old pumps, buckets, and windlasses. And he hears the dark drop. Okay, so the first sensual imagery that is used here is the visual sensual imagery, where he sees the pumps and the buckets and the windlasses, and he listens to the dark drop of the bucket, and then he looks at the trap sky within the uh, within small kind of well, the small diameter of the well, the smells, the olfactory, from the visual, the auditory, to the olfactory, the smell of the water weed, fungus, and dank moss. So, in this first stanza alone, you can see Seamus has used three sensual metaphors, metaphors of the senses. You have water weed, fungus, and the dank moss. And one in the brickyard with a rotted board top, I savored the rich crash when a bucketed down at the end of the rope. So deep you see no reflection in it. So in the brickyard there was this well with a rotten top, and he heard the rich crash. Now it's all auditory. He tunes his childhood memory as an auditory memory, and listens to the rich crash of a bucket, and the bucket plummets down at the end of the rope, and then so deep you saw no reflection. And then again, the depth of it, you can actually feel out here. The shallow one under the dry stone ditch fructified like any aquarium. There's another shallow well, okay? And if you actually were born in a village, you could in fact you could visualize so many wells here and there. And he also talks about the kind of shallow well under the dry stone ditch, where you have some kind of an aquarium up there. It's like it has fruitfully come out like an aquarium, where you dragged out long roots from soft mulch. You have long roots falling out. The mulch is the wet ground, okay, the wet ground or the swamp like wet ground. And soft mulch, when he's talking about softness of mulch, there's a kind of a tactile imagery there. The visual, the auditory, and the olfactory images, the sensory images, he comes to the tactile one, that of touch. And a white face hovered over the bottom. So when a child looks into the well from top, you can see a small white face, a small white face hovering like moon. I remember, when I was a child, when I used to look into the wells at night, and into the well near my house at night, you could in fact see a small crescent or moon out there. So even your face you could see at times. If it's not a deep well, definitely you can see that. And others had echoes, gave back whenever children, even adults, when we see the wells, and we always howl into it, and we can hear the echo back. And there's some clean new music out there. And sometimes this kind of echoes are very scary, and especially when you have that kind of depth out there, out of ferns and tall foxgloves. A rat slapped across my reflection. So at times, it's very scary with ancient creatures like rats slapping across the reflection. Suddenly, some kind of a rodent coming out of all of the sudden. And ferns and tall foxgloves, when it grows out of a well, that the well is quite ancient. Well has a lot of muck in it. It is quite ancient. And now to pry into roots, time to stare big-eyed Narcissus into some spring is beneath all adult dignity. I rhyme to see myself, to set the darkness echoing. So from past, these were past memories. A series of past memories about the well is actually worked up into the poem. And from there, when he comes to the last stanza, he says that now, that is at this point of time, to pry into roots, or to finger slime, to finger slime, to stare big-eyed Narcissus into some spring is beneath all adult dignity. When you want to look back into your childhood, when you look back into the kind of you have, it feels very narcissistic. It feels slightly dirty because you're touching the kind of slime of your past. But then it looks all like it's beneath your adult dignity. But then I rhyme to see myself, to set the darkness echoing. And he says, but then I rhyme, I write poetry to see myself, to see the narcissist which is looking back at me from the well. And I write to see the kind of echoing darkness, the echoing darkness of my childhood, the echoing darkness of my memories. So this is one of the poems which I would say that is very word wise. Seamus Heaney is a maverick of words. So the kind of words and phrases that he uses here, he uses assonance, like you know uh, pumps and buckets and fungus and bucket plummeted and moss and hovered and bottom and brickyard and spring and dignity and new and music. So this kind of assonance he uses quite a lot. Even you have alliteration, dry ditch fructified like aquarium. This is like assonance is interweaved with alliteration out here, and the combination of sounds, it creates a kind of uh, a kind of charismatic effect it produces out here. So this is also a poem which actually has a lot of allusions, has a major allusion worked into it. Allusion, as I have told you, as we have already discussed, is some kind of a reference to the past, to past incident, a mythology, a story, or a person. So here the allusion is, there is an allusion of Greek mythology out here. Helicon, in fact, is from the Greek mythology. In Greek mythology, you have Helicon's a mountain, and near this Helicon, you have two springs, which are very sacred in Greek mythology. And you have these springs have two muses here, Aganape and Hippocrene. These two muses are their favorite, hovering grounds are these springs near the Helicon. And these muses are the goddesses of inspiration. They are also the sources of knowledge. All right, so they live near the Helicon. And in one of the springs also you have the story of Narcissus. Narcissus, one of the most beautiful men or boys, who was in love with his own beauty. He was so much enamored with his own beauty by his own looks that he fell in love with himself. And in one of those springs, he fell in love with himself. He kept gazing at himself, and he, in fact, tried to hug his own image. And he fell into the spring and he drowned himself and died. So this illusion is actually worked out in this childhood memory of gazing at the wells. Okay, instead of spring, you have the wells. And this man, he says that, see, in fact, for me, gazing into the well or going back to a childhood memory, though it looks like it's well beneath my adult dignity, but that is all my poetry writing is all about. I rhyme to see myself. I rhyme to see the kind of narcissist that I am. I rhyme to see my childhood reflected there. I rhyme to see my past, which is reflected in the rhyme, in the rhyme of the mire there, the rhyme of all the muck and the mulch there. All right, and I also look back into the darkness of my being to, in fact, write poetry. So he says that it's all my reflection. Poetry is my reflection. He is, in fact, telling you why he writes poetry. In Seamus Heaney, you can see a couple of poems like that. His Digging is one, his Personal Helicon is another. He, in fact, gives us a glimpse of the process of writing. This poet, the purpose of this author is to say why he writes. He tells you why he is writing. He says he takes writing as a kind of instrument to look into his past, to look into his self, to look like a narcissist into his self. And whenever he looks into the well, he looks into his past and childhood, what he can see is he can get a better understanding of the poet which is there in himself. He gets a better understanding of a present through the darkness and through the roots that the memories, the roots, the long roots and the soft mulch which is reflected, which he sees within the within the wells. So personal helicon is like it is a personal mountain, and here the poet is nobody but a narcissus. So he says that poetry writing for him is not just a reflection of his childhood, of his past, but it's also suicidal. It's like killing himself. He's so much in love with his own vocation as a poet, of his own image, of his past, which can equally be, devastating, killing, and destroying. So it's kind of destructive kind of image of poetry writing that Heaney talks about. So why I chose this particular poem, which most of you are familiar with, is the fact that I want to show you how he has actually used both the form and content. The content is as important as the form, and that is where a good poem actually is born. A good poem is born out of its content and form. It's not just, a lot of people I've seen like writes a lot of slogan in the name of poetry, which I won't say is bad or it's bad poetry. I'm nobody to, in fact, give a kind of uh, a judgment on poetry like that. But the poets who've been famous, who've been read all over the world, were the ones who always gave equal importance to form and content. The content here is the poet actually explaining to you, explaining to himself as well, explaining to the whole world that writing poetry for is a kind of an exercise which is narcissistic, which is uh, self-destructive, and of course very reflective, self-reflective as well. But at the same time, while he tells you this, he also keeps a kind of an acute sense of form in his mind. When he in fact talks about the form, he does it he does it with words. He does it with the rhyming, the internal rhyming of words. First, the structure itself. He's written in quatrains. You have 5 quatrains there, I suppose. 5 stanzas with 5 quatrains. The 4 lined poems as quatrain. And of course, he also uses alliteration, he uses assonance, he uses consonants, all right, the internal rhyme. He works up the metaphor of the well, and he ties them to the allusion of a helicon, which Greek mythology. And for him, that kind of a mountain. So, and there is also the kind of opposition, the contradiction he does. He talks about the well, and he says it's a personal helicon. Helicon is a mountain, and hell is something which is a well is something that is deep inside. So he talks about the depth of his self as well as his ambition to, kind of write poetry and be mountainous as such, and perhaps grow into a mountain. So there is ambition in fact written into it. There's also the memory, childhood memory, the painful, darkness of childhood memory. It's not at all pleasant, right? He talks about fingering the slimy mulch. So it's not all pleasant. It's not all happiness that childhood has. It's also about the pain of childhood, but his ambition of, in fact, his towering ambition of becoming a poet, and of course his assertion of why exactly he writes poems. So this is the poem that I would like to. Is my time over? It's almost an hour. Should I go into the next poem or should I stop here? I think I'll take some questions, and then we'll go into the third part. Okay?
Sure, ma'am. Sure. Whatever is convenient for you, ma'am.
Yeah. So now to the participants, what I would like to say is that my session here was primarily to, approach writing poetry and teaching poetry in a way where you in fact start practicing and exercising it with the utmost consciousness of uh, how to approach, how in fact to look at poetry and write poetry with all the kind of honesty and sincerity within you, because this is a kind of a craft. Poetry is a kind of a craft where many poets can never be dishonest. So it wells from utmost honesty. See, like in fiction, also you can see there are plenty of places where you switch on roles. You, in fact, interweave stuff. You bring in your imagination. Your kind of most fruitful and most mature imagination is brought into writing poetry. But the string of honesty in almost all great poetry is something we can never ignore, and that is something if you want to be a better poetry teacher, if you want to be a better poetry poet, definitely that kind of an honesty definitely has to in fact sparkle through. And despite a lot of technical problems out here, I'm sorry for the hitches. I'm not yet used to Zoom. I thought it's like PPT, so definitely I had some problem in cutting and pasting and stuff like that. So I apologize for the kind of technical difficulty which happened because of me. But then I hope I could in fact reach you and tell you that the form and content of poems are very, very important, and the kind of honesty which is there in the author's purpose or the poet's purpose is also very, very important in writing poetry. And as teachers of poetry and as students of poetry or as poets yourself, if you have written poetry at some point or the other, you should keep on writing poetry. Then you should know that it's not a very simple kind of tentative, spontaneous exercise. Poets, in fact, spend years and years looking for a word. You're looking for the right expression, looking for the right phrase. In Poet Lover and Bird Watcher, that is exactly what Nizim Ezekiel says. It's a kind of slow exercise, and you definitely have to be patient. And if you want to write poetry, you have to be an editor of yourself. You have to keep on editing. If you okay, spontaneously, if you've written something, always get back to it, come back to it, and edit and make as many drafts as possible. So, a famous poet K. Sachidanandan once told me that, in fact, uh, whenever he gets back to a kind of a draft, whenever he gets back into his poetry draft, he edits it. He in fact pairs off certain things, and it's not like a kind of verbal diarrhea that poetry is all about. It's the kind of the right words, the right time. It's a kind of a sculpture where you in fact cut off all the excesses, and you make it perfect. Poetry is all about choosing the perfect words to express a perfect emotion, and also to express the perfect purpose of the poet. If you have any questions, please do ask me. I'll be happy to answer you. Yeah. Yeah, somebody has asked me contemporary poets. Contemporary poets, there are plenty. Some American poets I can tell you. One is Jericho Brown. He's got the Pulitzer Prize, and you should read him because there's this particular poem called "I'm a Virus." In fact, he says he's a virus, and this was written in 2018, much before COVID and Corona. In fact, caught us and ate us alive. So Jericho Brown is the person who can always refer to, and you have poets like Tracy Smith. Can I write it down here on the chat box? Jericho.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. Tracy Smith. And there are a lot of Indian poets that you should know and read. You have sizzling young fronts in Indian poets writing in English. You have poets, of course, like Sachidanandan and all are bilingual poets, have been writing for quite some time. But the young poets, there are like Sumana Roy is one. Okay. Then you have Arjun Rajendran. Um, you have Chandra Mohan. See, it's like the Indian scenario is also like sizzling with poetry now. So many talented poets are writing. They're keeping the poetic uh, life alive. You have Rohan Chatri, Vivek Narayan, Arundhati Subramaniam. So, um, to be a good poet, again, poetry is like a very uh, what will I say? It's a very personal thing. But then there are some poems which becomes very famous. So what I have noticed in these poems is that there is a kind of an equilibrium of both the form and the content. The content is basically, some kind of a message the poet has to in fact give. It can be a political message. It can be a personal message. Like Shel Silverstein, it was about a child getting addicted to gadgets, right? So it can be either a TV or mobile phone in the present era, fine, and it can be political, it can be personal, it can be confessional. The contents can be varied, but then the form, the language that is used, and the form that is used, all these have to be, in fact, in tune with the content. So they have to go hand in hand. The kind of juxtaposition of content with form makes a good poem, and of course, uh, when you in fact send poems for analysis and for kind of publication and all, uh, what you see is that they also look for new images, new metaphors. So the kind of cliches that we see all around, like black is a symbol of beauty, and something that is scary, the cliches of being scared and stuff like that, which had always been there. But then poets, and especially people who analyze poems and publish contemporary poems, they look for a lot of new images, innovations, as well as freshness, in the symbols that you are looking for. When we consider, can you suggest a poem talking about the art of writing poetry? See, two poems which I can actually think of. Okay, wait. Uh, what are the qualities a poet should have to be a poet? Sharda, yeah, hi Sharda. I've written a couple of poems. I'll shoot you for your valuable comments. I'll contact you. Thank you, Sharda. Please mail me. You have my mailing address. I'll send it to you on FB. Then, can you suggest a few poems talking about the art of poetry? See, almost all poets have actually written about the art of writing poetry, okay? And especially Nissim Ezekiel is a person, in fact, in India, he's written about poet, lover, and bird watcher. It's about writing poetry. Kamala Das's introduction is actually about the art of writing. It's not about the craft of writing poetry, it speaks about why she writes poetry. Seamus Heaney's very famous poems like Digging, and the poem that I read out right now, uh, Personal Helicon, is a famous poems which again talk about the art of writing poetry. I think Digging is one wonderful poem. Again, he goes back to the childhood and he looks at his tradition, ancestry, and he says, see, my father was a farmer, but I am a person who, in fact, digs into words, digs into the roots, and creates rhymes. Okay. While we consider interlingual, multilingual, or linguistic references and allusions while writing poetry, is there anything we should keep in mind? Yes, Jaren, it's like what I have seen is that when we use a lot of Greek mythology and Roman mythology from an Indian context, it looks very artificial as such. But usually, what teachers of poetry and fiction uh, ask us to do is they ask us to write poetry from our cultural context. So the stories which we are familiar with, for example, if I want to write about Mephistopheles, we can use uh, a cultural kind of equivalent here. You can use Chatan in Kerala if you're from Kerala, or Jarin, of course, you're from Kerala. You can use Chatan, all right. Or if you want to talk about Sisyphus, again you can use a contemporary equivalent of uh, why this cultural context is very important to the poet. We should not disown them, but then we should definitely, and playing it up is also not very important. But then definitely, if we use in the right context, our cultural kind of associations, that will be having a great impact as such. And of course, cultural references and your religious references can also be relevant. And religion also, it's like the cultural component in the religion cannot be in fact effaced at all. So definitely uh, this culture, the illusions within the culture, like very very important. The entire world is actually looking for something fresh. So they would definitely, I know Narayana Prandan would really get enamored by such images, such there are many poets who would love even if you want to write a poem for the first time. See, there's nothing like you have to start reading from now. Uh, what I used to do is that I read a poem every day, a poem or two. Uh, I wouldn't ask you to go on reading an FB poem, but you have organizations like Poetry International, a poem a day, and places like that. Even New York Times have a lot of very good poems coming up. So I would like you to, in case you're very fond of romantic poets and all, definitely you should read them. But contemporary, if you can read a poem a day, the kind of poems which appear on New York Times, the poetry, etc. That will be really really good. Even Granta has poems. So these are the contemporary publishers which publish world class standard poems. While teaching, sometimes there is a need to describe meter equality, though it's not nowadays. How to tackle this? Anoop Titi has actually written this question. See, we are lucky because in English you have only 5 to 6 meters. In Sanskrit, there are thousands of meters. So we really, and among all these things, usually it's the unstressed and stressed. The iambic pentameter is used by most of the poets. So but then what I have noticed is that uh, meter is a problem for many Indians because English is not a native language. The kind of stress and unstress we give in syllables is directly influenced by our native language. Actually, there's nothing single poem to be to be more clear, combining Shakespeare's sonnet with the Spencerian sonnet. So Ajin Shah, in fact, I very personally, I wouldn't go for sonnet style and all. But I'll tell you what how very famous poets who are writing now do it. They try to establish themselves as poets first, and then they take on to canonical forms. All right, they try to get the name established, then seriously they go ahead and start restructuring poems and poetic structures and things like that. It's like once you know your grammar properly, you can in fact you can tamper around with grammar, right? So once you have established that kind of a poetic canon of your own, definitely you can play with a lot of you can uh, take on two types of sonnets, sort of interweave them and refurbish them or readapt them or do whatever you want. But definitely it's very important to in fact start publishing a poem with your own and establish your own poetic idiom first. Now, what's the difference between Indian poetry and American poetry? Okay, I would like to talk about contemporary Indian poetry and contemporary American poetry because I have contemporary friends in both these streams. to talk about the tradition and all, I don't have that kind of knowledge because it needs a lot of reading. I know only snatches. I know my favorite poems and poets only. So I cannot actually talk about the history. But what is happening right now, I'll tell you, Sakshi. Uh, what is happening right now is that in America, writing is something which is very fashionable, which earns a lot of money too. There are so many journals, so many platforms where you can actually submit your work. You have places like the Duotrop, you have places like the Submittable, etc., where you can submit your stuff, you submit your poems, your short stories, etc., and you can either, kind of, they will accept it for publication if it is good enough for the standards. And acceptance rate is very, very less. It's like 5 to 6%. Okay, so there are these students who get into creative writing courses right from their graduation onwards in the US. All right, you have BFA, you have MFA, Master of Fiction Studies, and Bachelor of Fiction Studies, Master of Poetry Studies. You have poetry courses are there, diploma in courses, poetry are there. Even online, you can find a lot of masterclass, poetry master classes there, okay, in poetry writing and in fiction writing. And you have Udemy courses, full-time profession. Because writing doesn't pay well in India unless you are a celebrity writer or anything like that. So that is one difference. In the US, you have so many courses on poetry, etc. You have professional poets, and poetry becomes a kind of profession. In India, so many people writing poetry, especially youngsters, but a lot of them who are established poets, the youngsters in India who are established poets, are those people who've actually kind of attended some kind of a fellowship or residency in poetry, and they've come back to India, and they've started spreading Indian English poetry like that. Okay, that is one thing. So the kind of passion with which poetry is like seen in the US, you cannot find that kind of passion out here in India. But I can definitely tell you that there are so many youngsters who are passionately doing it. I know during the COVID times also there were so many online, poetry fellowships and poetry groups which have been, in fact, looking into poetry. That's one thing. Two, performance poetry versus print poetry is a major thing. Okay, performance poetry is very, very popular. It's after the beat poets were the first performer poets, I would say. Um, Now, after beat poets, what happened is that from 2000 onwards, performance poetry, especially the young ones, young people have actually in the US, they have actually started performing poetry. And you also have Instagram poets like Rupi Kaur. She's an Instagram poet. They're very famous. The youngsters are actually follow her with so much of enthusiasm. So these are the trends in the US. But then print poetry always has the kind of value, and it has a lot of weightage over other poems, and it pays also in good poetry journals like the Rattle and all. Rattle, New York Times pays around $200 to $300 for a single piece of poem. Rattle pays $100. $100 is 7,000 rupees for a piece of poem. So it becomes, once you're an established poet, it becomes a kind of a very lucrative kind of profession out there. I have not actually reached that kind of a place, but then things are, in fact, things are really, really getting on well. Now, the third point I would like to say is that Indian poets as well as American poets, they are on the search to establish their own poetic idioms, and that's a great news because, see, it's the most exciting time for poetry right now. Let me tell you, for art and poetry, especially the COVID times have been, it's quite. I don't want to say that, but that's the truth. Art always thrives in kind of adverse situations, and right now, so people have so many COVID poems have actually come out, anthologies have come out, and people are trying to outdo each other in writing poetry. There's a kind of an artistic competition that's actually happening there, which is not bad, which is really good. Um, Now, what is the difference? Asha Nair to everyone. I don't know what feedback for. Could you please tell the poem that really inspired you to write poems? Yes, actually, a poet, in fact, inspired me to write poems. I was in the Northeast teaching in a university for quite some time, and the Northeast poets in India, I forgot to mention them. You have a very good group of Northeast poets. Okay, you have Robin Nagom, Mona Zote. Um, the names are quite difficult, but Northeast poets, again, they have an amazing community. They have a great kind of a feedback system which enhances each other, and they keep writing poetry. And poetry, that's very, very important. Sakshi, thank you, ma'am, for your session. It's very helpful. I'm really sorry for the hitches in the beginning, but I think we've caught up, with time. Thank you so much. Any more questions? So the poem, there's no one single poem that has actually inspired me. There are a lot of poets who have been writing in the past and who are writing right now. Uh, Jane Hirschfield is one poet who has actually inspired me quite a lot. Then Denise Levato is there. I'll write their names so that you can actually go ahead and check them. And so many Indian poets. See, poetry can only sustain if you have communities where we sit together, recite poems, take feedback on each other's poem. What happens is that in certain communities, what I have seen is that uh, people say your poem's so good, it's so great, and they would also tell you your poem's so good, so great. So that kind of a positive, that I wouldn't say positive. It's not actually very creative kind of saying that. You write wonderful poems. It's not really good feedback as such. It's not creative, in fact. You should be able to take in uh, a lot of criticism. People should tear you apart. You should have the guts to, in fact, stand it, and then out of everything, you should come out victorious. I just want to ask how one can pluck up the courage to start writing poetry amidst inhibitions in society. Rima, that's see, all Indian female poets have, in fact, uh, fought against the most adverse conditions in their life to write, and that's what is very, very important. Okay, because it's like your life should, in fact, you should leave snippets of your life here, and then you should move ahead. Uh, these are the names that I would like to show. Now, you see, women especially, they face a lot of adverse situations, like doing the domestic work, writing. Unless you're very, very rich, you cannot actually find a room of one's own and then sit and write. And definitely, there's also you know this problem of you're keeping your profession and your domestic work life interwoven with each other and balancing it, and in between, you have to I know a lot of friends who in fact do all this multitasking wonderfully together. It's very stressful, but somewhere, we ought to really, really uh, go ahead and write. There's no kind of shortcut to writing. There's only one panacea: to write, to write, and write. For a poet, you have nothing else to do. Whenever I attempt writing poetry, it turns to be subjective. It's always taken a melancholic strain. That's fine. That's absolutely fine. Personal tones are very important in poems. So even people like Seamus Heaney, they write subjective poems, and you should not be ashamed of your voice or your personal tone. It's honesty that matters. So you can't talk about political matters altogether. Personal can be political too, right? So one thing is, it's like coming out. When you come out with poetry, you should be unashamed. You should be absolutely honest. You should be able to take the brickbats and then take it on your stride, take it as constructive criticism, and go ahead. I've been longing to attend your session. It's now fulfilled. Sharda, thank you so much. When we get art for our poetry, it might affect our exposure of delicate thoughts and put forward through the poems. How could we deal with that? When we get torn apart for a poetry, Perfect exposure of delicate thoughts and put forward through poems. I actually didn't understand that question. Could you please elaborate? Oh dear. Ben, can you elaborate? Can you? I didn't understand the question. Ma'am, did you share the list of poet names? Okay, I think I did. I think I did.
Ma'am, I'm Ben Milton here. I would like to clarify the question which I put forward
Ah,
earlier. Am I audible over there?
yeah, you were.
All right. All right. Well and good. The thing is, certain poetry is not about general topics per se. For example, if I want to write about my feelings with respect to what I feel for someone, then that is written in the form of poetry. Or when I have some other issue, I'm trying to a particular issue. When I write one poetry, when it gets published, people will criticize it. On the whole, when that gets criticized, how does that affect me personally?
Ah, yes. So, Ben, this had been a kind of historical issue as well, because like
Yes, ma'am.
like kids, he was snuffed out by criticism. At 26, critics
All right.
critiqued his poems, and he was snuffed out. He was so sad. Because we poets, as such, very sensitive, very emotional people, and that's precisely why you people are poets, or we are poets, right? Now, how do we deal with it? This is where contemporary poetry can actually really help us. Can you mute your microphone a little bit, because there's a lot of noise coming there? So in
Yeah, sure,
contemporary
sure. No issue.
poetry, yeah,
Sorry.
yeah. In contemporary poetry, what you do is you critique each other. Okay. In the beginning, it's all very difficult. It becomes, quite painful to us. I remember, I used to get a lot of rejection letters from abroad, from a lot of journals. See, out of 100, uh, around around 85 used to get rejected, and only 15 used to get published. Even now the ratio is 4:1. Okay, so those rejections do not matter, do not actually mean that you're bad. It's only that you can actually build up yourself a little bit more, right? In fact, you can work on your poem. You have to rework on your poems, get back to your poems, work on it. That criticism not in fact pull you down. People are there to criticize. If it is constructive criticism, you should definitely take it on your stride. If it is destructive, you should have that kind of, you should know that kind of instinct to sort of brush it apart. Okay, that's very, very important. And that is where in fact your poetry should stand the test of time. We cannot be Keats anymore. Keats could survive in the Romantic era. He could stop writing poetry. He could die at 26, and definitely he became famous after that. But in our time, it's like it's all about how tough you are, how perseverant you are to get back to your poetry, and how hardworking you are. It's like you definitely, if there's criticism, definitely to get back to your, it should not hurt your ego. Get back to your poem and take a look at it afresh, or keep your poem aside. Maybe after 2 or 3 weeks you can get back to your poem and take a look at it again. So these things should not destroy you. They should only build you up little by little. Okay. So do not get pulled down, but take everything as something creative, because you are a creative writer. Obviously, these are creative things. You get bad feedback also, take it on your stride. If it's extremely destructive, ignore it. That kind of perseverance is very important for poets to write right now.
Thank you, ma'am. That was very resourceful, I would
Ben,
say.
I wish
Thank
you
you.
all the best. I wish you all the best. Okay.
Thank you, ma'am.
So, can I close the uh, conversation here? Can we stop here, Krishna Priya?
Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, this is Krishna
So
Priya.
I will also give my mailing address. Out of this session, I want you, if you can write a poem and send it to me. The topic that I can give you is childhood photograph. Okay. Take a look at your childhood photograph or somebody else's childhood photograph, and yeah, try to write a poem with the content is childhood photograph, and the forms you can use different forms, and please send it. All right, please send me, and if there's a good poem, I'm sure there'll be a lot of good poems coming that way. Definitely, I'll send it to your college and they can publish it somewhere.
Okay, ma'am. Ma'am, this is my personal request. Ma'am, can you please recite the poem Personal Helicon?
Shall I?
Yeah.
Okay. Personal helicon. My could not keep me from wells and old pumps with buckets and bin glasses. I loved the dark drop, the trap sky, the smells of waterweed, fungus, and dank moss. One in a brickyard with a rotted broad top, I savored the rich crash when a bucket plummeted down at the end of a rope, so deep you saw no reflection in it. A shallow one under a dry stone ditch, fructified like any aquarium. When you dragged out long roots from the soft mulch, a white face hovered over the bottom. Others had echoes, gave back your own call, with a clean new music in it. And one was scarcesome, for there, out of ferns and tall foxgloves, a rat slapped across my reflection. Now to pry into roots, to finger slime, to stare big-eyed narcissus into some spring is beneath all adult dignity. I rhyme to see myself, to set the darkness echoing. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you
Thank
so
you
much.
all. Okay.
So,
Bye.
I guess that
Bye,
brings us to
everybody.
the session.
Bye, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you.
Session complete ആയില്ലേ? Full ആയി. Session full complete ആയി.